Secure that line before she snaps.
Steady! Keep her steady! We're losing way!
If we do not attack here, we lose the advantage. I cannot authorize this course. The risk is too great.
She's going down! Brace yourself!
On the night of October 22nd, 1707, 4 British warships struck hidden rocks off the coast of England and sank within minutes. 1,400 sailors died, including an admiral. There was no battle. No storm had driven them off course. The fleet was heading home after a successful campaign, following a route they knew well. And yet, in the span of half an hour, one of the Royal Navy's most experienced commanders sailed his entire squadron directly into a reef that every navigator in England was trained to avoid. This is the story of HMS Association and the Scilly naval disaster, a case that exposed a flaw not in seamanship, but in the science itself. The facts seemed impossible from the start. Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel had spent decades at sea. His fleet of 21 ships had just completed operations in the Mediterranean during the War of the Spanish Succession. These weren't merchant vessels with rookie crews. They were ships of the line, the most powerful warships Britain could build, each commanded by experienced officers who'd navigated these waters dozens of times. And they were almost home, just days from English ports, close enough that some of the fleet's officers believed they were already in the safety of the English Channel. Instead, they were about to sail into one of the deadliest navigational disasters in British history. Only one man would live to describe what happened aboard HMS Romney that night. Quartermaster George Lawrence found himself in the water, clinging to a piece of decking in total darkness. He could hear the screams of drowning men around him. He could feel the current pulling him toward the rocks, and he had no idea where he was or how he'd gotten there. Lawrence would later testify at the court-martial. But here's what makes his account so telling. He couldn't explain the wreck either. Even as a survivor, even having lived through it, he had no idea what had gone wrong until investigators pieced it together weeks later. Which raises the central question: if the men on the ships didn't know they were off course, what would have told them? And more troubling, with the tools they had in 1707, could anyone have known? To understand what went wrong, we need to understand what navigation meant in 1707. Today, we think of navigation as checking a screen. You know exactly where you are, down to the meter. But in the early 18th century, finding your position at sea was a problem with only half a solution. Latitude, your north-south position, could be determined fairly well. At noon, a navigator would measure the sun's height above the horizon using an instrument called a backstaff or quadrant. If the skies were clear, this gave you a reasonably accurate latitude reading. Sailors had been doing this for generations. Longitude, though, your east-west position, was a mystery. The problem was time. To know your longitude, you needed to know the time difference between where you were and a reference point like Greenwich. But clocks in 1707 couldn't keep accurate time on a moving ship. The rolling motion, temperature changes, and salt air made them useless within days. That question, where are we exactly, had no perfect answer in 1707. So navigators fell back on dead reckoning. You estimated your course and speed, marked it on a chart, and hoped your calculations were close. Every half hour, someone measured the ship's speed using a log line, a rope with knots tied at intervals that was thrown overboard. By counting how many knots paid out in a fixed time, you could estimate speed. Combine that with your compass, heading, and the hours traveled, and you had your position. In theory, let me show you how small these errors could be and how they accumulated. Imagine you're navigating by dead reckoning. Your compass says you're heading due east, but your compass has a 2-degree error you don't know about. So you're actually heading east-northeast. Over 1 hour at 5 knots, that's barely noticeable. You're off by maybe half a nautical mile. But Shovel's fleet sailed for 9 days from Gibraltar. Let's say just 6 of those days had that same 2-degree error compounding. By the end, you're not half a mile off. You're 30 miles north of where you think you are. 30 miles. That's the difference between open ocean and the western rocks of Scilly. And here's the cruel part. You can't feel it happening. The sea looks the same. The ship handles the same. There's no alarm bell that tells you your position estimate is drifting away from reality. The error is silent until it isn't, which meant Shovel's fleet was in trouble long before anyone realized. On September 29, 1707, Admiral Shovel's fleet left Gibraltar. They were bound for England, sailing north through the Atlantic. Almost immediately, they ran into rough weather. Westerly gales, heavy cloud cover, rain. For over a week, the fleet sailed through conditions that made celestial observations impossible. Day after day, the navigators couldn't see the sun. They couldn't check their latitude. They were flying blind, relying entirely on dead reckoning. And those silent errors had been building for 9 days. By October 21st, the fleet's navigators knew they were getting close to land. Depth soundings, measurements taken by dropping a weighted line to the seabed, showed they'd reached the continental shelf, shallower water. That meant the British Isles were nearby. The question was, which part? On the morning of October 22nd, the weather finally broke. The sun appeared, and for the first time in over a week, the navigators could take a proper latitude sight. They measured their position at roughly 48 degrees, 50 minutes north. For a moment, it looked like the fleet's luck had turned. After 9 days of uncertainty, they finally had solid data. Or so they thought. Admiral Shovel called a meeting of his ship's masters, the senior navigation officers from each vessel. He needed a consensus on their position. Most of the officers agreed. Based on the latitude reading and their dead reckoning, the fleet was somewhere near Ushant, an island off the coast of Brittany, well south of the Isles of Scilly. If that was true, the way ahead was clear. They could set an east-northeasterly course and sail straight for the English Channel. But one voice disagreed. We don't know his name, but we know that the sailing master of HMS Lennox, one of the ships in Shovel's fleet, stood in that meeting on October 22nd and said the fleet was closer to Scilly than the others believed. Think about that moment. You're a mid-ranking officer. You're disagreeing with an admiral in a room full of senior captains. Every other navigator in the fleet says you're wrong. Their calculations all align. They have the latitude sight to back it up. You're basing your objection on what exactly? A hunch? A feeling that the dead reckoning doesn't add up? Shovel made the rational choice. He trusted the consensus. In any other situation, that would have been the right call. The master of HMS Lennox was correct, of course, but he couldn't prove it. Not with the tools they had. Here's what the fleet didn't know. First, their latitude sight might have been off. After days without practice, taking a single noon observation in rough seas left room for error. More critically, they had no idea how far east they'd drifted. The strong westerly winds and a northern current had pushed the fleet further than their dead reckoning suggested. They weren't near Ushant. They were already north of where they thought, closer to 50 degrees latitude, not 48. And they were about to sail directly into the western rocks of the Isles of Scilly. There's another factor that didn't help. After the disaster, the Royal Navy surveyed the fleet's compasses. They found that most of them were defective, showing an alarmingly high rate of error. If some ships had been steering even a few degrees off their intended heading for the entire voyage, that small constant error would have compounded over hundreds of miles. But perhaps the cruelest detail is this. The Scilly Isles were on their charts. The navigators knew the rocks were there. The problem was the charts themselves were wrong. Captain Grenville Collins's widely used English coasting pilot placed Scilly about 8 nautical miles from its true position. Even if Shovel's officers had guessed their longitude perfectly, they'd still have been aiming for the wrong spot on the map. So the fleet sailed on. Visibility dropped as evening approached. Darkness fell. At around 8 o'clock, HMS Association, the flagship leading the formation, struck a submerged rock called Gillstone Ledge. Let's talk about those 3 minutes. When Association struck Gillstone Rock, she was doing roughly 6 knots, about 7 miles per hour. A 90-gun ship of the line displaces around 2,000 tons. That's the momentum of a moving building hitting a granite reef. The impact would have torn through the hull planking interval instantly. Water would have rushed into the lower decks before anyone could react. An Association was a 3-decker. Her lowest gun ports were only a few feet above the waterline in calm seas. Once they went under, the ship was already gone. 800 men on board. Maybe a dozen made it to the upper deck before the ship rolled. None made it off. From the ships following behind it, officers reported seeing flashes, probably distress rockets or lanterns being lit in desperation. They heard muffled cannon fire, the traditional signal for danger. And then nothing. Just a debris field in darkness. The men on those following ships had seconds to process what they were seeing. Association, the flagship, the most powerful ship in the fleet, had simply disappeared. Was it a reef? A submerged wreck? Enemy fire? They had no way to know. HMS Eagle struck the rocks about 10 minutes later, likely hitting Crim Ledge. Then HMS Romney plowed into Bishop Rock. The officers on those ships had warning. They'd seen Association's signals. But in the darkness and confusion, they had no time to change course. They were still trying to figure out where the danger was when they hit it themselves. Eagle sank with all hands. Romney broke apart on the rocks. Out of roughly 290 crew, only George Lawrence survived, clinging to wreckage until dawn broke and he could see land. A fourth ship, the fire ship HMS Firebrand, managed to scrape off a reef temporarily after striking. Her captain spotted the faint glow of St. Agnes Lighthouse, a coal fire and a brazier on the island, and tried to navigate toward it, but Firebrand was flooding. She sank in Smith Sound before reaching safety. 18 men from her crew made it ashore alive. The rest drowned within sight of rescue. By morning, the scope of the disaster was clear. 4 ships lost, roughly 1,400 men dead. Admiral Shovel's body washed up on a beach at Porthela Cove the next day, along with the bodies of his 2 stepsons and several officers. The nation was stunned. This wasn't a combat loss. It was a navigation failure, and it had happened within sight of England. In the aftermath, 2 myths took hold. The first claimed that Admiral Shovel had actually survived the wreck, crawling onto a Scilly beach half alive, only to be murdered by a local woman who wanted the emerald ring on his finger. The story goes that she confessed on her deathbed decades later. It's dramatic, it's memorable, and historians are confident it never happened. Shovel's body was found lifeless, without evidence of murder. The ring was missing, likely taken by scavengers or lost in the surf. The murder legend didn't appear in writing until 20 years after the disaster. Classic folklore, not fact. The second myth involves a sailor who supposedly warned Shovel the fleet was off course, only to be hanged for insubordination hours before the wreck. Again, no contemporary records mention this. The story first surfaced around 1780, more than 70 years later. While it's entirely possible that someone, perhaps the master of HMS Lennox, voiced concerns, there's no evidence of an execution. These legends tell us something important. People needed to believe someone was at fault. A murderer, a disobedient sailor. Anything except the uncomfortable truth that the best navigators in Britain simply didn't have the science they needed. What we do know is this: the Royal Navy took the disaster seriously. They court-martialed the surviving officers from HMS Firebrand, though the men were ultimately acquitted, and the Admiralty ordered a comprehensive investigation. Here's where investigators found something unexpected. Navy officials ordered a survey of every compass from Shovel's fleet, the ships that survived at least. They went to Portsmouth with testing equipment. They checked 112 compasses. Only 4 were accurate. 4 out of 112. That means the vast majority of ships in the fleet had been steering by instruments that gave them bad information. Not slightly off, badly wrong. Some compasses showed errors of 5 or 6 degrees. Now, the compass defects alone didn't sink Association, but they're evidence of something bigger. The entire navigation system was built on unreliable foundations. The charts were wrong, the compasses were wrong, the method for finding longitude didn't exist. It's not that Shovel's navigators made mistakes, it's that they were asked to navigate with tools that weren't up to the job. In the years that followed, the Scilly disaster became a rallying cry for navigational reform. Now, there's a common belief that the 1707 wreck directly caused the Longitude Act of 1714. That's not quite accurate. Parliament didn't immediately leap into action. The Longitude Act came 7 years later, after sustained lobbying by scientists like William Whiston and Edmund Halley. But those advocates used the Scilly disaster as their key example. They argued, this is what happens when we can't find longitude. 1,400 men dead because the science doesn't exist yet. The act offered a prize of £20,000, a staggering sum for anyone who could solve the longitude problem. It took decades, but it eventually led to John Harrison's marine chronometer, the first clock accurate enough to determine longitude at sea. In that sense, the loss of HMS Association did change navigation. Not immediately, not directly, but it provided the proof, written in shipwrecks and drowned sailors, that the old methods weren't good enough. So what really sank HMS Association and her consorts? The surface answer is simple. They hit rocks because they didn't know where they were. But that's not a failure of seamanship. Admiral Shovel and his officers did everything right by the standards of 1707. They took soundings. They compared notes. They waited for clear weather to get a celestial fix. They made the best decision they could with the information they had. The real failure was systemic. Navigation in the age of sail was built on guesswork for half the equation. You could know your latitude if the weather cooperated. But longitude? That required either impossible precision in timekeeping or a method that didn't exist yet. Dead reckoning was the only option, and dead reckoning was always approximate. Add to that the environmental factors. A strong current the navigators couldn't measure. Defective compasses introducing constant heading errors. Charts that misplaced entire islands. And weather that kept the fleet blind for over a week. Each mistake was small. Each error in isolation was survivable. But navigation is cumulative. The errors stacked. And when the fleet finally got a latitude fix on October 22nd, it was already too late. They drifted too far off course, and they had no way to know it. The Isles of Scilly weren't a surprise. They were on every chart. The danger was known. But knowing a hazard exists and knowing where you are relative to it are two very different things. HMS Association went down because the tools of her era couldn't answer a simple question. Where are we exactly? And until someone invented a clock that could survive the ocean, that question would remain half-answered. The wreck lay hidden for 260 years. In 1967, a Royal Navy diving team finally found the remains of Association on the seabed at Gilstone Ledge. They recovered cannons, coins, the ship's bronze bell, tangible echoes of 1707 brought back to daylight. The discovery sparked a treasure rush and eventually new laws to protect historic wrecks. Even centuries later, Association had something left to teach. If that wreck felt inevitable, it's because the tools of the time made certainty almost impossible. Next episode, we'll unpack navigation before longitude, how sailors estimated position, and how small errors quietly stacked into disaster.